Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. Quick reminder, support the Rebel Transmission. Best way to do that, become a paid subscriber on the Substack. We do private weekly chats every week or two. I compile the week's news with my commentary for members only. And on occasion, we bring back previous podcast guests for a live call with members only that's recorded and posted later for members who couldn't make it on Rockfin Premium and on the Substack paywall. You can also donate to the Geopolitics and Empire for the mission. You can use DonorBox, Wise, Buy Me a Coffee, and check out the website for the complete list of options there. You can also purchase a consultation to chat with me about expatriation, geopolitics, conspirology, whatever you like. And do check out this month's sponsor, which is the Expat Money Summit, hosted by Mikkel Thorup of the Expat Money Show. It's taking place online entirely from October 7th to the 11th. It's free, so you can watch the live stream every day, and then it's available for free for 24 hours. But beyond that, they've got a VIP option. If you use the promo code EMPIRE, you'll get $100 off the VIP option. That's got a lot more perks in it. You get access to the recordings and VIP sessions, VIP panels. I will be on one of the VIP panels with the guys from Anti-War and Libertarian Institute to discuss World War III. And during the summit, they're going to be talking basically about internationalizing, creating a plan B, getting second passports. I got 3 passports, and they do come in handy, especially in this day and age of collapsing empires, COVID-19, 84 and whatnot. And most of the speakers, the headline speakers, have been guests in Geopolitics and Empire. Ron Paul, Doug Casey, Scott Horton. I got to meet Scott Horton, Tom Luongo, Mark Faber, and others. So the link is in the description, expatmoneysummit.com. Check it out. You do have to reserve for the free ticket. And returning to the broadcast, it's been a few months. Joining us again is Jeremy Ryan Slate, the scholar who has examined the Roman Empire through his studies at Seton Hall University. He's an entrepreneur, author, Renaissance man, athlete, host of the Jeremy Ryan Slate Show, CEO of Command Your Brand, the website jeremyryanslate.com. Welcome back, Jeremy.
Hey man, I'm super glad we connected a couple years ago, man, because I've had you on my show I think like 4 times or something like that now, and you always deliver so much value, and I'm just always grateful to be on your show, man, and have a great chat.
Yeah, and I love the stuff that you're doing. You've been on my TNT show a number of times, and I've used your Command Your Brand. You've got a lot of great guests, and so we're on the same frequency. And I thought I'd bring you back to do a deep dive on Roman Empire. So kind of leave aside mostly current events, which is a lot of what I talk about. And I think it's important from time to time to forget the current thing and go back into history. Was it Churchill or someone that said, if you know the past, then you can know where you're going. Kind of, you can extrapolate. And I thought maybe to start, this meme of men thinking of the Roman Empire. So I think this was a number of months back, and you've got these different websites that I maybe the terms better. These trad type websites, and they're pushing a lot of this Roman Empire imagery. And so, what was going on with this meme?
Can I say first and foremost, I don't know if you've heard the conspiracy theory, and it's a really interesting one that Churchill might not have done all his speeches, by the way, that it's supposedly the guy that did the voiceovers for Winnie the Pooh on the BBC would sometimes handle Churchill's speeches when he was just a little too hungover. It's a really funny conspiracy theory if you dive into it. But anyway, because then it's like, we'll fight them in land, in the air, in the sea, Io, Antigua, too. I think it's interesting when you look at this whole discussion of the Roman Empire, and I think it comes from a couple different things. And I'll say to your audience, first and foremost, I'm going to talk in a lot of broad terms today. So if you're a history person, don't take any insults out there. For those of you that aren't history people, definitely do your own research, because my idea is to open up history to regular people and really help you understand these things so that we are not really doomed to repeat them. But I think when you look at why people are thinking about it, I think there's a couple reasons. Number one, this idea of masculinity has really started to disappear, and it's become belittled in a lot of ways. And if you look at a society like Rome, in a lot of ways, it was the ultimate masculine empire. And I think it's seen as a way that, was there a class system? Absolutely. But you look at even in the later empire, you have somebody like an emperor named Maximinus of Thrax, or Maximus from Thrace, which translates to the big guy from Thrace. He was started as a foot soldier in the army and worked his way up, and eventually through a coup is able to make himself emperor. So I think people look at it as there was an ability to kind of change my own stars in a lot of ways, and there's not really a place for men right now in society. It's kind of looked down upon, and it's become a more feminized society in a lot of ways. I think that's one part of it. I think the other part about it too is there's a lot of parallels between what we're doing economically and what we're doing with managing, I guess, these modern empires in a lot of ways, which are very similar to the ways that empires have crashed and fallen in the past. And I think it's important to be able to look at these things to say what worked and what didn't work. And I think there's a lot of information that Rome can teach us from that.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, and those are some good things. Not everything is black and white, and we, we're going in a bad direction today, and it's good to look to the past for some of the good things and try to have it researched. I also want to, before going further into the Roman Empire, this phenomenon sort of going viral, whatever you want to call it, having your day in the sun, your 15 minutes of fame, so to speak. Geopolitics and Empire has made international news, usually not in a good way, been featured in Le Monde or Associated Press with hit pieces attacking my guests. But hey, I've made international news. But now, you recently reached escape velocity. You've been on a tour, InfoWars, Timcast, Sam Tripoli, so many shows discussing this, because that's your background as well. And just real quick, your thoughts on this sort of phenomenon, content creation, podcasting, social media, getting to this moment, something I've been thinking about. I'm reading the book right now, the autobiography of John Romero, who created the video game Doom, which, I played like a maniac when I was a kid. And it's such an amazing book. And it's shocking to see how dedicated day and night he breathed and lived programming and video games. And that led to his success. And I think there's a lesson here for many people. People ask me about podcasting, and Patrick Henningsen of TNT, my former colleague, he gave a speech not long ago saying, but you got to be working at this for a decade. And I remember, I think you said you started podcasting 2014 in one of your interviews. It's been about 10 years for you. And so there's people who ask me about podcasting, and I'm like, look, you got to be working at this for years and years and years. So any thought on your recent sort of moment on the Roman Empire?
Well, I think the thing that's interesting is, number one, like, this is the stuff I've always had so much interest in. And it's funny, in grad school, like, my degree's in the Roman Empire, but I studied that and also medieval Russian history. So go figure, which two things that have become very important in the last few years. So I'm like, oh, Novgorod, I know all about that. Like I've learned about a lot of things that are in the news recently as well. But I think when you take a look at kind of 10 years of doing something, I think often we've had a lot of success in the last year. It's been kind of crazy. You mentioned some of the shows we've been on, and I keep telling myself, like, at some point in time, this trend is going to end, because it's how it ends. It's how these things work, right? They have legs and eventually they die. And it seems like just when it's about to die, something else big hits. And we have a lot of stuff happening in September and October related to this trend, which is even going to kind of put us to another level. So I think part of it is you got to put in a lot of years of work, but at the same time, you can't fake it as well. Like, I have lived and breathed this stuff since I was a teenager. And I think it's important that it's when opportunity meets your skill set, you're really in good shape. And that's not to say, like, I didn't have a successful show before. I've had a pretty good show for the last 10 years, but I really wasn't hitting publicly on the news cycle like I am right now. So it really is just kind of opportunity meeting, personally, what I've been obsessed with for years.
Yeah, that's very cool. And so, again, all of us can learn lessons from this sort of stuff. And we need to be, that's why I like to pay attention to how things are going with you, with my other podcast colleagues, learn from everyone and so forth. So,
well, I was also obsessed with Alexander the Great too. That's what got me into all this stuff. Like, you see my office and I look like a nut job. I have a we're in the studio now, but in my office, I have a bust of Alexander the Great on my desk. I have a Roman gladius hanging on the wall. Like I look like a crazy person, but like I live and breathe this stuff, man. And my obsession with Alexander the Great led me to this really weird, strange, obscure article about Augustus Caesar and Alexander, who, by the way, lived 300 years apart. But Augustus, after the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, actually prays to the sarcophagus of Alexander. I'm like, that's really weird. Why is that guy doing that? And to me, that opened me up to all of this study of like, well, why did people worship the Roman emperor, and how did Augustus do that? And Augustus, he's a brilliant propagandist. And what he actually says on his deathbed, which is a quote of Greek tragedy, is he says, "If I have played my part well, give me a round of applause." And so it's very interesting then, because that makes you to think, well, who is Augustus really? He's somebody that played a part his entire life, and I think it's quite interesting.
You mentioned Alexander the Great, and one of the most interesting things for me regarding him was when I was studying the Bible and theology over 20 years ago, when I was really getting into it. I would find historical sources in the book of Daniel in the Old Testament it's said that it refers to Alexander the Great, some of the prophecies, and that actually in his day, someone, I don't know if they were Jews or whoever, pointed out to Alexander, look, this is talking about you. And so that's something people can look up. And so, Roman Empire, I visited Rome a number of times. My home of Croatia used to be part of the Roman Empire, where I went to.
It was like not just part; it was like part of the heartland of the Roman Empire and the actual empire stage.
Yeah, and where I went to high school in Croatia was basically on Roman ruins. I remember one summer, they had Croatia, a wonderful place, is known for tourism. They filmed Game of Thrones there in Dubrovnik, and I went to high school in Zadar, and it's a what do you call it, like a peninsula and the city, and you've got the cafes and all that. And I remember one summer, it was a cafe or just an open space, and then the next summer it was dug up and they found Roman ruins, and then the following summer it was covered again. They're like, okay, we found the Roman ruins, but the space is so limited that we need to cover it back up again and use it for.
Well, actually, one of the most consequential Roman emperors in Roman history is from Croatia. He's born in Soluni, Dalmatia, which is now Solin, Croatia. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Solin?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Diocletian, who's actually the guy that splits the empire between East and West in the 280s. So there we go.
Yes, that's in Split. That's where I went to. I went in fifth grade. I was in Split, or Spalato in Italian, and I've been to Diocletian's palace a number of times. Apparently, he retired. He wanted to retire and just grow cabbages or something. But yeah, and so that's sort of my interaction with Rome. And I remember many years ago I studied history. I remember in Chicago, where I'm also from, in one of the history museums, they brought a lot of, I think from the Pompeii incident, they brought a lot of stuff. And so I've seen some of that stuff up close. And so I want to get your big picture. And maybe my first question would be, it seems to be one of the world's most defining empires. The Mongolian Empire, I've lived in Mongolia as well and spoken Mongolian, but the Mongolian Empire isn't talked about much, even though it was the largest. It seemed more of a flash in the pan, but it seems that Rome has left one of the largest impressions of all empires. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, and it's, if you look at most of our modern society, it's a lot of it is based off of it, and we don't even realize it. Like, for example, the word inauguration, when a president takes office, augury was actually it was a religious thing they were these guys named augurs, and they would look at the signs of the birds, right? That's it's the word aves is where the kind of the word birds comes from. And they would look at the bird signs and they'd say, okay, based on what the birds are doing, can we either make this battle or put this person in office, whatever it might be? So the word inauguration comes from that. Augurs also used to pull the livers out of animals and look at, based on how a liver looks, like, is it a good idea or a bad idea? And it's funny too, because it makes you question, like, how much do they actually believe this stuff? If they pulled out one liver and it wasn't the, portent they're hoping for, they'd pull out another liver and see how that one was, right? Like, oh, one liver's good, one liver's bad, great, we're going to do it. So it is kind of interesting how much of our verbiage and our society and even our culture is based off of Rome. Most of the American government is based off of ideas of the Roman Republic. Interestingly enough, if you understand the Republic a little bit better, we missed a lot of functions of the way it's done. And I think our founding fathers were trying to look at, the Roman Senate actually, other than suggesting legislation, didn't really have a purpose. It would suggest legislation, and it would be up to the politicians to enact it. Whereas our Senate is more of a legislative body. So there are a lot of similarities and differences, but at the same time, I think it really has captured what our current world is, right? And I think the confusion for people when they hear Rome is a few things. Like the thing I hear most often is like, well, Julius Caesar, he was the first Roman emperor, right? And often, no, that's not the case. He was one of the later characters of the Republic period of Rome. So if you want to look at Rome, it's essentially 3 periods in time. It's a kingdom first in 753 BC to 509 BC, and then it's a republic from 509 BC to 31 BC. By the way, we're going to be using the terms BC and AD. I don't do BCE and CE because that's woke history. So then from 31 BC to 476 AD in the West, it's an empire. And if you even want to look at the East, 1453 is when it actually falls to the Ottomans. So it's almost a 2,000-year history of what is the Roman era in time. So it's a kingdom, a republic, and an empire. And I think often people are confused just with this empire period.
Yeah, the whole BCE thing. I was looking at a map right now, and it's like, well, you're still counting from the birth of Christ, so they can't escape it. So just accept it, and that's
it's Anno Domini, my friend, the year of our Lord.
Yeah, and again, that's proof again for the existence of Christ. And yeah, I was going to ask just one more thing before going further.
Sure.
How would you compare the Roman Empire? And so what you said, I think that's interesting. It's had a big impact. Its structure of the Roman Empire, the Senate, its customs, many things that many countries are still to this day using. And then later, had the various European empires, the Dutch, the Spanish, French, British. It seems Britain seemed to have been the sister empire. It's almost, it came out of Rome, and was way bigger. Basically, Britain ruled the world. Some people say it still rules. And just
you ask Richard Poe, they never stopped ruling the world.
Right. And so, how would you just briefly compare again the Roman Empire and these later European empires in terms of size, impact, or influence?
Well, I think it is one of the largest empires the world has ever seen. But you can also take a look at, and you can make cases for, the Chinese Empire and kind of how big that got in Asia. Because you have to remember, what they're calling Asia is they didn't really go much further than India. So they're not seeing a lot of different things you would consider to be Asia. And also, as you mentioned, the British Empire, they went about it in a very different way. Some of it's conquest, some of it's through joint stock companies and things like that. I think the interesting thing is, though, a lot of these later empires do tend to pull their inspiration from Rome. Whether it's using an eagle for a lot of things. The Nazis did it too, right? They pulled a lot of Roman history because even the word Fourth Reich, meaning Third Reich, meaning Third Kingdom, they saw themselves as kind of a later apparition of like bringing back the Roman Empire in a lot of ways. So like I think a lot of empires have looked at themselves similar to bringing back what it was for Rome. So maybe there's been empires like the British Empire that have, in a lot of ways, rivaled it. But I think a lot of them have pulled their inspiration, whether it's from their imagery or why they're doing what they're doing or how they discuss what they're doing, from the Roman Empire.
You mentioned Fourth Reich. That was a reference to the European.
Yeah, I was thinking of it's. I was reading the Jim Marrs book, so it's like I'm a big rest in peace fan of Jim Marrs and a lot of his work. Rise of the Fourth Reich is a wild book.
Well, that's how I refer to the European Union today.
That's how he refers to the United States government.
Well, they're both pretty much wedded at the hip. One created the other, so they're part of the same globalist plot. And just on studying Rome, I mean, if someone wants to study Rome, I've got somewhere in a box the multi-volume series by Edward Gibbon, the history.
Yeah, don't read that. You're gonna get so lost in that, man. Like it's because he's overly significant, and he also blames Christianity for a lot of things. And you have to understand why that is too. Gibbon early in life is raised a Catholic, but then he converts to being an Anglican. So he's got a bone to pick with the Catholic Church, and it shows a lot in his writings. So he tends to blame Christianity for a lot of things that Christianity really didn't do wrong. So I think if you're looking for good sources about Rome, one of my favorite, and he's more of an anthropologist, like he's not really a historian, is a guy named Adrian Goldsworthy. He writes some very, very good books. I'm trying to think of who else. Dr. Mary Beard is like the most recognized now, but she's like super woke. So I don't know that you really want to read, because she tries to find like Marxist class conflict and everything you look at in history, and it just isn't there. So Adrian Goldsworthy is great. I'm trying to think who else is very good.
While you're thinking, I would just add.
Yeah. Gregory Arlett is another one I really like. He has a very good, great courses work on Rome. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I would just say it's not about, and what you just said is good to keep in mind regarding Edward Gibbon, and myself and listeners. We all come from different perspectives, but in spite of their, every historian is going to have a different worldview.
No, absolutely.
I long ago abandoned this idea of, whether it comes to my podcast or anyone else's podcast or books, there's really no this idea of objectivity.
It's true, because I can even say that about my own work, right? Like I've pulled a lot of what I'm doing now, looking at, oh my gosh, what's happening here in America, right? And like, maybe I'm seeing parallels that aren't there, but like they're, to me, I see them, Yeah,
and we all have our own worldview, spiritual, metaphysical, political, and so everyone is biased. And in spite of the faults of these people that you mentioned, I think it's actually, it'd be good to read Gibbon and that woke history, and I kind of like, you put it all together, and then you sort of take away what you think is the most accurate. No.
Yeah, and as much as I've given Mary Beard a hard time, there is nobody that's written as much on Roman religion as Mary Beard has, and a lot of my master's thesis was based off of her work. She also put out a book in the last couple of years called SPQR, Senatus Populesque Romanus, and it's actually one of the best descriptions of how did Rome actually become an empire. So it's actually it is a very good book. SPQR is what it's called, by Mary Beard.
And just one example that comes to mind, I had on Doug Valentine, he's had a lot of great works. He's his leftist progressive, and his work is fantastic. But then when you read his comments online, he's got like Trump derangement syndrome. And I'm not a fan of Trump. I don't really care. I'm kind of in that sense apolitical, but it's kind of unhinged Doug Valentine's Trump derangement syndrome. But it was like, I can put that aside. His research on the deep state is fantastic, and I think that's the general approach that we should have. And the beginning.
And Goldsworthy, by the way, is one of my favorite. He's a little superfluous, so unless you've got 27 or 30 hours to read a book, it might not be something you want to confront. But I think he does a really, really, like, I got my best understanding of Julius Caesar by reading Goldsworthy's work. He's very good at what he does.
And there are some good courses, like on places like Coursera. I've taken a few in the past that really give you a good crash course on different subjects. The beginning, real quick, for people, I'm sure there's a lot of people that are not familiar, but there's the legend, right, of the brothers Romulus and Remus. And I remember when I was studying history as a kid in Croatian schools and in American schools, they'd be telling us about this. And so, just real quick, if you want to tell us a bit about sort of the beginning stages and the formation of Rome.
Yeah, so I guess the thing you have to understand is once again, a lot of what you understand about Roman history, a lot of it's actually written down during the time of Augustus, because being that he's the first emperor, he wants to be the one that controls the history, controls what you know about it. So the Aeneid, the famous work of Roman prose, is written in the age of Augustus. It's an Augustan work. A lot of the work of Ovid, who actually Augustus personally didn't like a lot, and he actually kicks him out of Rome, and he finishes his life outside of the city of Rome. Ovid's work is written during this time. A lot of Livy's work is written during this time. So a lot of what we know modernly now, Suetonius is written 200 years later, so it's written a lot later, but a lot of what you know about Rome actually comes out of Augustus's time period. So what the Romans try to do in their founding is they try to tie themselves to the Trojans from the Trojan War, and it's through this character of Aeneas. And Aeneas is a Trojan that leaves the battle after the Troy is conquered. He brings his son with him and his father Anchises on his back, and they go to a area in Western Italy, which will later become a kingdom called Alba Longa. Alba Longa is going to have a series of kings. Several hundred years later, we get to this guy. The Numitor is the name of the king, and he has a brother named Emulius. And my professor in school used to call him the evil Emulius, and I always thought it was funny. But Numitor is king, and he's overthrown by his brother Emulius. So Emulius makes himself king in place of Numitor. Numitor has a daughter named Rhea Silva. And there's a prediction that Rhea Silva is going to have children that overthrow and kill Emulius. So Emulius takes Rhea Silva and makes her a Vestal Virgin, because if she's a Vestal Virgin, she can't have children. So somehow there's an Immaculate Conception. We don't know how. And Rhea Silva gives birth to two twins, Romulus and Remus. And we find that once again, Emulius is concerned this is going to be the end of him. So he gives the order to have these two twins killed. What ends up happening is the person in charge of this is actually a friend of Rhea Silva and a former supporter of Numitor. So they actually float the kids in a river down a basket. Once again, this sounds very similar to things we've learned in history. So the kids are then picked up by a she-wolf. And the thing to understand is the word for wolf and the word for prostitute in Latin are two very similar words. So it might be a wolf picked them up. It might be a prostitute picked them up. We don't know. But basically, the idea is a she-wolf suckles these two children. They grow into big, strong warriors. They come back. They kill Emulius. They place Numitor back on the throne, and now they're really bored because they're like, well, what do we do? Like, we like Numitor. He's our grandfather. We don't want to kill him. So they actually go to try and make their own way. And they decide they're going to found a city, and that city will become Rome. Now, there's numerous stories about like what actually happens to Remus. But the most popular one is that the two of them fight and that Romulus kills Remus. And with whatever band of warriors they're walking across Italy with and whatever criminals they can find, they start this city called Rome. And then Mary Beard often talks about with Romulus, if you look at their 7 traditional kings of the Roman kingdom, the first is Romulus. She says he's probably the least likely to exist because he's kind of this like Mr. Rome character, right? All these things that they don't know how to tie to a person or why they do them. They say, oh, we do it because Romulus says. And he's also kind of the first deified king of Rome. So historically, they really tie themselves to this very interesting person of Romulus that may or may not have existed and likely committed fratricide, if you want to believe that.
And you know, we're scanning through history quickly, big picture, and it's always the onus.
Yeah, we just went through like 500 years in like 3 minutes there. So
yeah, and, you know, I'm not going to do a 5-hour Joe Rogan style thing, and it's the onus is again on the listener if they want to do deeper dives, get these books. I think. Yeah. You know, probably at some point later, I'll be revisiting and doing deeper dives on Rome just for myself. Like I'm talking about myself reading books, but you know, I'm looking at a map here just to guide me what you're talking about. And then Rome grows, it says, from a village to a city, later to a republic. And, you know, just as a personal example, trying to make this relevant, where I am living now in Guadalajara, Mexico, the second or third, it's debated, biggest city in Mexico, like where my home right now, maybe, you know, 15, 20 years ago, these were cornfields. You know, these were cornfields. This section of the city were like cornfields and plains. And that just kind of shows you how, you know, in many ways, it's the same thing that happens throughout history. There's someone comes, they found a small town, and that just explodes into this massive thing. And I guess, you know,
I think that's an important point too, because I think when people think of this, they think of kingdom and they think of castles and think of all these things. And have you ever seen, it's totally historically inaccurate, but it's an awesome series. You ever seen Vikings?
No, I haven't seen that.
Oh, Vikings is such a good series. So if anybody out there has seen Vikings, these guys were probably more similar to like Viking chieftains, like if you're looking at kings, where they might have been a king, but I'm sure if you went 50 miles away, there was probably another king, right? Like, and I think it's important to understand, like, maybe you could they're more like the guys in the movie Braveheart. They're like these chieftains or these warlords. They're called kings because because they use the word rex, which means king in Latin. But they're likely just like these chieftains or warlords of kind of these straw huts. There's nobody had a castle or anything like that.
Yeah, and so it begins to grow, and we've seen this repeated throughout history, all these different empires. And I'm just looking at my timeline here. Is some of the things that you've mentioned. Rome grows from village to a city. Republic, it becomes a republic ruled by elected officials. Laws are published. Construction begins.
The Constitution wasn't written, by the way. It was an oral constitution.
But later, that all.
No, it's never written.
Oh, okay.
It's always then what happened is when times got hard, they would be like, there's this thing called the 12 tables. So the 12 tables are written in the early republic, and that's because what was happening is rich people were like basically had all the political power, so they were just charging poor people with things, and they're like, well, hey, that's not fair. Like, what is this law you're talking about? So like the actual like political system isn't written down anywhere, but the 12 tables written in the early republic become like the status for the basis for actual law.
Not much has changed. The rich people have the political power. And so the highways, of course, that's a fascinating topic. I just found someone shared an article from Wired magazine from 2012, I think it was. It says here, 2015, here are all the roads that lead to Rome, and it shows a map of Europe, and basically it's all connected. It's
all like kind of going inward like this, right? Like on a semicircular angle.
Yeah, and so Rome grows. You have Punic Wars, and then Rome becomes to control more and more territory, and then
the Punic Wars are an interesting point too, by the way, because the Punic Wars, you could like really compare them to the War on Terror here in America. Because if you look at the Punic Wars comes for the wars against Carthage, which is in North Africa. In Latin, the word punes is the word they would have used for the Carthaginians. So that's why it's called the Punic War. But what happens is in order to fight these wars, which there's the first Punic War and then the second, it's kind of these like two periods in time. They have to militarize so much in order to win them. They come out of them something else. So I think it's also important to understand like how militarizing can change a society. And that's exactly what the Punic Wars did to Rome.
In some ways, for me, that would harken back to what happened to America, particularly during World War II. When you study, it was basically during and right after World War II that the security state was born with the Department of Defense, CIA, NSA, all these institutions. And for us, that's kind of like that was one of our major turning points. And then, we fast forward to Caesar becoming dictator of Rome. And, when people think of Rome, it's Caesar, right? Caesar salad. And the thoughts there.
I think the thing I understand, so he's born Gaius Julius Caesar. Romans they had very long names, and if they did something like really important, like they would get interesting names at the end of their name, like Lucius Cornelius Sulla, and he adds Felix at the end of his name, which means lucky, because he would always get himself in these positions he could work his way out of because he claimed it because of luck, and he likely had one testicle, by the way. But Gaius Julius Caesar is a character in the tail end of what's called the Roman Civil War. So I think to understand Caesar, there's a kind of a little bit of background you have to have in order to get up to him, because also historically, a lot of what you've been told about him likely isn't correct, because it often comes from this modern perspective where they're trying to tie a politician you don't like, often like they do with Hitler, trying to tie people to Caesar in order to change your opinion of somebody. Because once again, not a lot of people have learned this stuff, so it's much easier to convince them based on like Hollywood portrayals or whatever you've seen in the last 100 years. But the Roman Civil War lasts from 133 to 31 BC. And during that time period, what starts to happen is you start to have the rule of law breaks down. And so you have these two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. And Tiberius Gracchus is in office first. He holds an office called tribune. And tribune, they would use basically the power of the people to bring in like these very like populist reforms is what Tiberius Gracchus is trying to do. So he tries to bring in land for veterans. He tries to change the tax system. He wants to really reform things. So the Senate being mostly rich and powerful people, which Gracchus was, by the way. He was not a poor person. He was tied to the Scipio family, so it's a very famous and rich family. But he has kind of this populist bend to him. He attempts to bring in these land reforms, and the other senators pull legs off of tables and bludgeon him to death. So it's a big move that we've moved now from the rule of law to actually bludgeoning people in the Senate. Like that doesn't happen. Like we've the rule of law has started to break down. Now later, his brother Gaius will kind of seize this opportunity to try and make himself king, and people are going to turn against him, and he wants to commit suicide, but instead he doesn't really have the balls to do it, so he has his slave kill him. And that's kind of the start of the breakdown. You have this guy named Gaius Marius, who's like one of Rome's most famous military commanders. A lot of the things that you see in the Roman army, he's the guy that changes the armor. He's the guy that, builds what's the size of a legion. He's the guy that decides Rome's going to all march behind an eagle. So he does a lot of these military reforms. And he holds this office called consul. Consul, there were 2 of them every year, because Rome didn't want one person to hold all the power. So it was like having 2 presidents. You were supposed to hold the consulship once and not hold it again for 10 years. Marius holds that office 7 times. And they use the idea of, we have an emergency. We can't follow the laws. We have an emergency. These two groups of people named the Cimbri, and also this guy, it wasn't Jugurtha, it was Jugurtha. I'm sorry. Yeah, it was Jugurtha, this other military leader. And because we have these 2 problems, we have to not follow the law, which isn't written down anywhere. And we're going to allow him to hold this office 7 times. So you once again had the law breaking down. Then this battle against Jugurtha is actually won for Marius by one of his lieutenants, this guy named Sulla. So then Sulla decides, well, you know what? I'm going to name myself dictator. And dictator used to be a 6-month office. He actually makes it an indefinite office, which lasts about 4 years, from 82 to 78 BC. And during his rule of Rome, he starts this process called proscription. Proscription would mean that they would basically one day, 200 names show up on a tablet in Rome. And now what you would have to do is chop off someone's head and bring it to Sulla, and there was a reward for that. So every day, new names start popping up on this list. So this is the instability that you have to understand that Julius Caesar walks into when he becomes consul in 59 BC. All right. Now I'm going to explain Caesar. Is that cool?
Yeah.
Okay, I know it's a little long-winded, but you have to understand how we got here. It's kind of this power vacuum, and then this brilliant general and politician who Caesar walks in. So in 59,
just before you start on Caesar, I had a comment, where have we seen this before, where governments use state of emergency just to continue on? And
it doesn't change, man. It's the same playbook.
and also I feel like in America, we're one step removed from politicians bludgeoning each other. I'll just use the latest example. Congress, for me, is a symbol of the swamp. It's like Congress basically attempting to bludgeon Donald Trump, right? Last month with the attempted assassination. There's different views.
No, it gets better when we get into Caesar in a couple minutes, because you're gonna be like, oh my gosh, this sounds even more similar. But go ahead.
I was just saying, we're one step removed from. I mean, Robert, all these politicians now assassination attempts. But anyways, go ahead with Caesar.
And once again, I apologize to our Roman historians out there, because I just took 100 years and broke it down into 7 to 10 minutes. They're going to be like, you skipped this and you missed this and you didn't talk enough about this. It's like, come on, man. This is so people can understand how we got here. So Caesar becomes consul in 59 BC. His colleague is a guy named Marcus Biblius, right? Because as I said, it was 2 guys, not one guy that hold the consulship. So the first thing Caesar does, his entire life he's been broke, by the way, even though he has a famous family name. His father had invested in some bad things, lost all the family money. But the Julii clan, Julius, is still a famous name. It's a patrician name. So he would still be able to hold all these offices even though he was broke. What he ends up doing is continually borrowing money. Most of the money he actually borrows from the richest man in Rome, is a guy named Marcus Crassus, which, by the way, man, if you want to find a George Soros character, Marcus Crassus is very interesting. Most of the Senate owed money to Crassus. So because everybody owed money to Crassus could basically run things behind the scenes. So he's consul in 59 BC. He's broke. He owes a lot of money. The first thing he does is he goes back to the reforms of Tiberius Gracchus. He's like, we want land for veterans. We want to change the tax system, because we want to basically give Marcus Crassus the ability to tax people more because that's how he makes all his money. And he ran a fire company where he would start fires, and then he would charge you to put the fire out that he just started. So he starts to do these reforms, and he gets pushback right away from his colleague Biblius, who's actually the guy behind him is Caesar's biggest enemy, a guy named Cato the Younger. And every time Caesar would try to do something, Cato the Younger would block it. And so Biblius tries to vote against this. And there's this thing where they could use the tribune power, meaning they could take a vote directly to the people and bypass the Senate. So he gets the people to vote for land reforms and tax reform. So the people then chase Biblius into his home, which he doesn't leave for the next year. So they end up typically with a consulship would be called the year of those consuls. So it would be the year of Caesar and Biblius. What they end up calling it is the consulship of Julius and Caesar, because Caesar is now kind of ruling by himself. So the one that ends up happening is Caesar makes a private agreement with Marcus Crassus and also Rome's most powerful general, Pompey the Great. And this is what's called the First Triumvirate. So basically, for a year, these three guys are deciding everything that's going to happen in Rome. His consulship ends, and then he becomes what's called a proconsul. So that means consul outside the city of Rome for 9 years in Gaul. And he has about 10 legions, and he kills upwards of 1 million people in the years he's in Gaul. After that time period ends, once again, as I mentioned, Cato the Younger is his enemy, and he's going to try and block him in every way. What Cato says is, well, you were corrupt in your years in office, Julius, and you were corrupt in your years in Gaul, and you've committed crimes that, sure, I know you don't see them as crimes, but I've decided they're crimes. So they're going to charge Caesar with crimes if he comes back to the city of Rome. Once again, I said this sounds very similar, right? We're passing somebody that's just in office, crimes against them. So Caesar says, okay, well, I'm going to run for consul again, because if I run for consul, you're not able to be brought up on charges of any sort for that year. So he writes a letter to the Senate, and he says, I would like to run for consul in absentia, because Rome's political system is in person, right? So he would have to actually show up to be elected. And if he shows up, they're going to charge him with something. The Senate agrees. Caesar's going to be able to run in absentia. Cato has that law overturned, and he says, no, still got to show up. So then Caesar comes into northern Italy with one of his 10 legions, crosses a river called the Rubicon, and says the die is cast. Which, by the way, it's a mistranslation. He was quoting Greek poetry, and the actual phrase would have been, let the chips fall where they may. So he comes in, Caesar has called their bluff, and they're like, oh, crap, he's actually coming, and he's got an army. So what ends up happening is Pompey, who's no longer friends with Caesar, goes to the east to try to raise an army. The Senate runs away, so Cato and all his friends just leave the city, and Caesar just shows up, and he's like, I guess I'm in charge now. And that's how Caesar ends up becoming the guy in charge of the Roman Empire, or the Roman Republic, which will later become an empire. So they kind of like call his bluff, and then they run away, and he kind of just ends up in charge. Now, the next couple of years, he'll be chasing Pompey's army across Italy, and eventually he'll be killed by the Ptolemaic king, and Cato the Younger will commit suicide. So, like, you're gonna it's not the same, I think, historically as you're told it is. I apologize that it was long-winded, but to really get it, there's a lot to get there, man.
and again, I just can't help, I as a Christian, have this biblical worldview that, many things are just timeless. Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. Not like this progressive view where, I think the truth is out there and God doesn't change. The truth doesn't change. Many aspects of human nature don't change, as opposed to this progressive utopian worldview where the truth is always changing, and we're getting, moving towards this future, this mythic future where we're going to reach this utopia and truth. And but so many things that you mentioned, like, we can apply to today with between Democrats and Republicans, or even in Europe, in different countries, and EU, and politicians and parties. And so, again, many of these things just repeat throughout history. And then if you want to tell us, the famous Ides of March, I left my TNT show this year, and it just so happened I my last show was the Ides of March.
March 13th?
Well, the 15th, no, is it? Or the 13th?
I think it's the 13th the Ides of March, but anyway.
And so, yeah, I quit then. And so they take out Caesar, and then we get to basically Imperial Rome, no?
Well, so yes and no. Like, it's not as clean as how we get there. I promise I won't go into as long and winded an explanation as I just did. But Caesar ends up becoming dictator in 44 BC. And dictator was like a Roman office. You would typically hold it for 6 months. But as I mentioned, during the time period of Sulla, they stopped respecting the 6 months because they figured that one person could solve things faster than two consuls, right? And he still had a colleague, right? But he was just called a master of horse, the magister equitum. But Caesar becomes dictator in 46 BC. He's going to die in 44. But in 46 BC, the first thing he does is he pardons all of his enemies. And that's going to bite him in the butt later on, because those are going to be the people that kill him and then also write all the history about him after him. So a lot of what you know about Caesar comes from people that didn't like him very much. And as I said, I don't think he's the best guy historically. I do think he's misunderstood in a lot of ways just because we don't have all the data. He reforms the calendar because the calendar we use today is still based on Caesar's calendar, because Rome's calendar was kind of like missing a month. And every couple of years, the seasons would be so off, they'd add an extra month to it. So he does a lot of very populist reforms in his time as dictator, but the Senate doesn't like this because this removes power from the Senate. And that ends up being why he's assassinated in 44. The whole thing of et tu, Brute, which likely came from Shakespeare, not actually from what happened. He probably would have said something like, they do this to Caesar, would have been more like what he would have said. He talked about himself in third person, if you've ever read Caesar's commentaries in the Gallic Wars. But so that ends up happening. And then they have the reading of Caesar's will. And in his will, he does something wild that's not expected. He adopts this guy that's kind of loosely related to him as his son, named Gaius Octavius. And Gaius Octavius will become Augustus. And what ends up happening then is Augustus and Mark Antony and Marcus Lepidus create what's called the Second Triumvirate. And these three guys then chase Caesar's assassins across Italy. They later kill them. But then, just like I think is going to happen with the New World Order in a couple of years, they're fighting each other, right? Because, okay, well, now we have nobody else to fight, so who of us is in charge? And that battle ends up being won by Octavian, later Augustus, after the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. And I believe it's in 27 BC, he gets the title Princeps, or Prince, First Citizen. And that becomes the first emperor. And that's going to last for 503 years of the Western Roman Empire.
And then to scan again forward, because the podcast format, we're not going to do 10 hours, and just to get people, the big picture.
I apologize too, because as I said, some of these things are so long-winded, but there's so much background information.
I don't mind it. I don't think the majority of listeners mind either, and that's what I like to do. And then sort of maybe to discuss what your particular focus in your studies. I think you said in the 3rd century you looked at the cult of personality, or
no. So I actually looked at exactly at this time period we're on now at Augustus, because what Augustus did is he took a lot of Roman religion and used it in order to get people to worship him. So one of the first things he does after taking power is he sees a comet go across the sky, and he goes, "Oh, that's my father Julius. He's taking his place in the heavens because he's a god now." So he deifies Julius Caesar. So you have the deified Julius Caesar is the first thing that happens. Now you have to think, if your dad's God, what does that make you? God. So he's very smart in how he does that. So then he also looks historically at how people looked at Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great took a lot of Eastern influence and brought it into not just Macedonia and Greece, but also into how people looked at a ruler. Because Alexander's empire was huge. He didn't rule it for very long, but it was huge. And he brings in this process called proskinesis from Babylon. And Macedonians were a little bit freaked out. They're like, why are you doing this? But basically, it was where you laid your body in front of the ground in front of the emperor. Now, Augustus doesn't do that because he knows people won't accept that. Your Croatian buddy, Diocletian, he will start doing that in the 280s. And people are kind of like, I guess whatever, we can do it. He's going to take that word princeps and change it to dominus, or lord. So that's kind of where we get the... I guess Croatia gives us the model for the medieval kingship. So thanks, Croatia. But what ends up happening then is a lot of the things that Alexander did and a lot of the imagery he does and a lot of the ways he carries himself will be things that Augustus does, whether it's making his face on coinage. So every time people use money, they think of Augustus, or putting statues of himself all over his new empire. And in these statues, he's never more than about 30 to 35 years old. So that he's forever young, right? This young, vibrant Augustus, even though in his later life, he's a very unhealthy man and people are very surprised he even lives as long as he does. So a lot of what he does kind of creates this cult of emperor worship, which is going to go for another 500 years. Now, he knows people aren't ready to offer sacrifices to him. Now, they have him do it on his birthday, right? So like, oh, you can offer sacrifices on my birthday. This is going to happen in the later empire, and not very far on. In the first 100 years of the empire, you're going to have Domitian, which is going to have people, they decided to actually deify him and offer sacrifices directly to him. So Augustus is very pivotal in kind of how ruler worship starts, which then goes through kind of your early empire. And then Diocletian kind of really pushes the gas down and says, okay, so now I really am God. And you're going to worship me. So it's a very interesting thing to take a look at, man.
During COVID 1984, I did some research to see
I love that you say that every time, by the way, without even hesitating.
Well, because I think it was like I first started using that phrase like February, March, almost at the start. And I remember before I got banned from PayPal, thank you, Department of Homeland Security. I was on Spiros Kouras's show, and someone sent me $20 in PayPal saying, "You're the first person I heard say COVID 1984." I have that email, I think, somewhere. But I was researching sort of the mark of the beast throughout history. I think it's a principle that's sort of been around. I think a lot of prophecy, it's kind of like dualistic, where the principle is there and it happens throughout history, but it's going to culminate at some point. And so and the COVID stuff with the passport control, the digital passport certificate. And I was looking at, the Nazi health pass, the Holy Roman Empire, right? The Roman Catholic Church. I actually found a primary source that said, if you don't believe exactly what the Roman Catholic Church says, you will not be able to buy or sell. So you're seeing these iterations.
Well, look at what happened to the Cathars during the Albigensian Crusade. Like the Pope kind of just raised an army. He's like, all right, we're going to kill a couple thousand of you guys because you brought in this worship cult of Apollo into Christianity.
Yeah, and then I went back to what you were talking about. You probably know in better detail, where I guess it was what you just explained, where I found in Rome in a certain period of time, people had to offer pagan animal sacrifice, and then they would get like a certificate or something. And if they didn't do it, they could, I guess, be fined or jailed or killed. And then back then, people were dealing in fake, I think, certificates, just like they did in COVID time. And there was persecution. So any thought on that?
Well, this happens during the time of his name's Decius, and I'm trying to remember what year. Was it like 249 to 251 AD? So we haven't quite hit we're 30 years before we get to Diocletian, and he kind of changes how the empire is set up. But Decius, things are going really crazy in the 3rd century. Inflation is running wild. By 284, it's going to be at 15,000%, because what's happening is emperors have started to gain their power from who has the better military. So you have these emperors aren't ruling very long in the 3rd century, and they would raise an army, pay them more money, but they don't have any money. So what do? You clip pieces off of coins, you add other pieces to it. And what happens is actually by the time of Aurelian in the 270s, the silver coin is actually bronze. And they're like, no, it's silver. It's silver. No, it's bronze, guys. So what ends up happening is either people won't accept these coins, or they want 5x, 10x, 100x of what it would be previous times during the 3rd century. So things are going really crazy. You have kind of this central power issue because these guys can't stay in power. So they start bringing barbarians off the provinces to fight in their armies, paying them with money that really isn't money. And you have part of the Western Empire breaks off and forms what's called the Gallic Empire, which is going to last for, I believe, like 10 years. A Roman general just decides, you know what, you guys can't stop me. I'm starting my own empire. And in the East, you have another general does the same thing. I believe his name was Posthumus, or was Posthumus in the West. But anyway, he forms what's called the Palmyran Empire. So you have the empire is now shrinking and falling apart. So to people living during that time period, they would have thought the gods were very, very angry with them. And when you understand Roman religion, you understand like it's not like how we go to church every week. For them, they would have like once a year on that feast day of that person, they would offer sacrifices. And then many times during the year, that temple might actually be closed. But what ends up happening is Decius Trajan, he's born Decius, but he takes the name of Trajan, who's actually runs out Rome when it's the largest in 117. So he says, oh, if I take that name, maybe things will get better. Guess what? Things don't get better. So then he starts requiring people to make pagan sacrifices. And those passes that you talk about start occurring. This becomes a big problem for Christians because Christians just will not offer sacrifices, to the emperor, to any pagan god. And this becomes the largest persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire. Now, funny enough, this is in the 250s. By 312, it's going to be mostly not mostly, but it's going to be on its road to being a Christian empire, which by 380, it actually is a Christian empire. So we're not that far away from, I guess, the tables being turned very quickly.
Yeah, that is fascinating. And, for you, maybe what are some thoughts when it comes to the Christianization? For me, I don't like, I don't think it's, I mean, there's some good things, but I'm always wary when the state and Christianity come together, and then the state that's when they start to dilute the faith and mixing it with other things. And any thought there's on Christianity and the empire?
Well, there's often it's heavily debated because people say, well, does Constantine, who's the first Christian emperor, does he actually believe what he believes? And if you look at kind of his life, earlier in his life, he worships this god. I think it was from Syria or Egypt, but the god is called Sol Invictus, or the immortal sun. And if you look at a lot of early Christian like visual representations, they change in the time of Constantine because he applies a lot of what he believed about Sol Invictus to these kind of early visions of Jesus. So, as you said, once the state kind of gets their hands in, they trying to turn things to kind of suit them. So there's this debate of, does he actually believe this, or is he realizing, okay, if I unite the empire under one religion, it's going to be easier to put this thing back together that's kind of falling apart, because it had broken into East and West under Diocletian. He actually decides to do that. But Constantine is not the last, but he's one of the last emperors to rule a united empire. Theodosius in the 380s will be the last to rule a united empire. So he's really trying to figure out, like, how do I fix this thing? So did he actually believe it, or was Christianity a solution to him? We don't know. But when he decides to become a Christian after the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312, only about 2% of the empire was Christian. So it is kind of why it is kind of a strange, why is this guy doing this type of thing, right? Now, he doesn't actually get baptized until his deathbed, and that's because how Christianity and baptism were looked at during that time period is different. They believed that your baptism could wash away all of your sins. So, well, let's wait till the end of life and we can kind of like do some bad stuff and, get rid of it all. Because sure, he's one of the first people to live his life as a Christian, as an emperor, but Constantine is a pretty bloodthirsty guy. Like, he kills his own wife, he kills one of his children because he's afraid of like losing power. And his son Constantius isn't much better than him. So there is a lot of questions this raises. He also has one of the first church councils, the Council of Nicaea, and that's where the Nicene Creed that's used in the Catholic Church comes from. Like basically deciding like, well, what do we believe? Because during this time, there was another form of Christianity that was very, very popular, and believe it or not, the barbarians, a lot of them were Christians, but they were a type of Christianity called Arian Christianity, which was under this guy named Arius. And there was the big thing they were debating was the true nature of Christ, or the true nature of the Trinity. And actually, the idea of the Trinity and the date we celebrate Easter come out of the Council of Nicaea. Later on, there'll be other councils which take a look at, what books are going to have in the Bible and things like that. Some of these things happen under Constantine, some of them happen under later emperors, but he's really kind of this pivotal character to making Rome into a Christian empire. And what starts to happen is, in political positions, well, he starts to favor Christians. So once again, you have to question, like, do people believe this, or are they changing just because it's politically expedient for them to do so, right? Now, by the time we get to the ruling of Theodosius in 380, he's actually going to make Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. And under Constantine before that, though people could practice Christianity openly, and there hadn't really been any persecutions until 50 years before under Decius Trajan, Christianity was technically illegal. So you have Constantine makes it legal to practice Christianity, right? Because if he's going to practice Christianity, well, this thing can't be illegal. But it actually becomes a Christian empire. It's the official religion of Rome in 380 by Theodosius. And I apologize once again. I'm long-winded, guys, and that's just, there's a lot of background to this stuff.
As you were talking just now, I felt like I want to go back and rewatch movies like Gladiator and whatnot. And so,
Gladiator's so full of BS, man.
Right, but it's entertainment. You get that emotion, that sort of feel for it. But Collapse, then, just if you could take us then through briefly again the Collapse, and then because I've heard you on other podcasts, there are some similarities to what's happening today, perhaps to the American empire, and some things that are not similar. So if you tell us about how sort of Rome died. I know some will say no, we still live under the Roman Empire. You're going to give your thought on that. Do all roads lead to Rome? Is it the Jesuits and Vatican that controls the world still today?
It's the city of London, man. Come on. So I guess if you want to look at it, like, the problems of the 3rd century are never really solved. Like, have Diocletian, our Croatian friend, he actually makes it stable for quite a while, because he changes the empire into what's called the Tetrarchy. So it's ruled by 4. So you have two, but now we have 4 emperors. You have 2 senior emperors and 2 junior emperors, and they're each ruling a different part of the empire to try and, like, manage the thing. Because the problem is it's so big, and now you have all these barbarians in the provinces that a emperor also had to really be a military commander now, because he had to really keep these barbarians from coming in. And you also have Marcus Aurelius that in the 160s actually started giving them money, right? So you have a lot of these problems that start destroying the currency and also destroying what is the empire. So if you want to look at why Rome collapses, it's ultimately a currency and immigration problem that they can't solve. They keep continually bring people off the provinces because these generals need more people to fight in their armies. So the armies start to become fully barbarian. And if you do get a chance, look up the military uniforms and the dress of people in the 3rd century. It is nothing like what you think classical Rome looks like. They look more like medieval knights. The dress is very, very different, where they wouldn't have been wearing the tri-piece armor that we see. They would have just been wearing chainmail. So things are very different in the 3rd century because the army is becoming very barbarian. So they're losing kind of their identity as Romans, but also the currency is out of control. As I mentioned, by the time of Diocletian in 284, it's at 15,000% inflation. So they never fully solved this. Diocletian gives them a little bit of, extra time. Constantine does a little bit more with monetary policy to try and fix it. But these barbarian invasions continue. These civil wars continue, meaning that emperors would continually raise an army, declare themselves in charge. So what starts to happen is by the time you get to the 5th century, the currency is on the verge of collapse. The empire has become almost a barbarian empire. The emperors are ruling in name only after the sack of Rome in 410 by Alaric, and you have really barbarian generals that are just kind of running the Roman emperor like a puppet. And in 476, the barbarian general Odoacer takes the final emperor, Romulus Augustus, and he retires him. And he says, we're going to give you a pension every year, but there's no more emperors. I'm the king of Italy. And that ends up kind of being how Rome really fades out from being an empire to being like these Roman kingdoms that'll later be under Odoacer and Theodoric and guys like this. Now, this part is high. That's 476. This is highly debated, but it's my opinion. Most of the history you have from this time period is actually written by the Eastern Roman Empire. There's some things that come out of the West, but most of it comes out of the East because there's less literacy in the West now because it's becoming more and more barbarian. The Emperor Justinian in the late 5th century has this idea he wants to rule a united Rome. So in order to save the thing, we have to destroy it. So he brings in an army and he tries to reconquer Rome. And they destroy so much of what's left in order to bring it back together. And he and his general Belisarius can't even really hold it anyway. So it goes back to just being a barbarian kingdom, but a barbarian kingdom that has substantially less wealth because Justinian has plundered it to try and reunite it. So if you want to look at the fall, that's how it happens. If you want to look at, as a lot of historians are going to disagree with me on that, so your comments on this one might be fun. But if you want to look at what's similar to what's happening globally, especially here in the US, monetary policy is out of control. We are charging down a road we're charging towards fast. Borders don't seem to matter anywhere anymore. So you're having kind of not just identity of countries that don't matter as much anymore, but also just like Cloward and Piven talk about with collapsing the welfare state. Well, that's what we're going to start to see happen is a lot of these welfare programs that countries are running are going to start to collapse these countries now because you have new people coming in that never paid in to take part in these programs, taking part in these programs as your currency is collapsing. And it all ends up with us eating the bugs. That's kind of just where it goes, man.
Yeah, that's where we're at. And just real quick, right after Rome then sort of dissipates, would you say that then we have, it takes a couple centuries, what transitions into where the Catholic Church now takes charge and you get this like Holy Roman Empire, yeah?
Yeah, well, because as I mentioned, a lot of these barbarians start to become Christians later on, but there's like these like Arian type of Christians. You're going to have the Frankish kingdom. I think is it Pepin the Short? So this is a little bit out of my depth. So I'm kind of going from what I can remember here. Pepin the Short ends up being one of the first united kingdom of the Franks, which that's kind of like France and a little bit of Germany. Later comes to Charlemagne, who's kind of the first Holy Roman Emperor, I believe in the year 800. And this would have been very confusing to the Eastern Roman Empire because the Eastern Roman Empire, which we call the Byzantine Empire, goes until 1453. So they would have been like, Roman Emperor, what are you guys talking about? I'm the Roman Emperor. Because they would have still called themselves Romans. They never called themselves Byzantines. That's just what we called them to be able to differentiate. So that's a big confusion. And it just seems like it's really a power play by the papacy, really, because in the Middle Ages, a lot of the political power has kind of flown to becoming spiritual power. And the Pope is very, very powerful, after the fall of Rome. That'll dissipate later on. But, even in the 1492, I believe, when Alexander VI becomes Pope, he's the one that splits what we know as America between the Portuguese and the Spanish. There was an intense amount of political power by the papacy in the Middle Ages.
And it goes, I've had a number of guests recently and I think we can see the trend. Everything that you just explained, Rome rises, falls, dissipates, power is diffused, goes to different places. It moves up, more north through Europe. And then you get these European empires. And then that goes to America later, which now seems to be dissipating, and it's going to the east now, to the BRICS world. How do you think the American dissipation occurs? And I think, and I don't think this is in any way anti-American. This is just realistic. Every single power, nation state empire has its day and decline. That's just a fact of history, fact of life. Every currency goes to zero. There's never been a currency that's not gone to zero. So it's not it's just real being realistic. How do you think what happens with the American empire? Does it it could take a while? No, I mean, it could take a while
because, as I said, like the Roman Empire in the 280s is at 15,000% inflation, and it still lasts till 476, so like almost 200 years. Now we're moving a lot faster because we're able to like create fake money on a computer really fast by just adding some ones and zeros. They like to call the printing of money quantitative easing, so you don't know they're printing more money. So So we're nowhere near 15,000% inflation, but we're going that way fast. And so I think that's one thing to consider is we're kind of doing Roman Empire money creation at warp speed. So that's important to understand. Now, honestly, how it happens, I don't really know. And that's why like the thing that has bugged me is this whole discussion of national divorce, because national divorce is the Gallic Empire and the Cimmerian Empire and, kind of very little Rome at the center. Like that actually starts to break things apart because the reason America is able to do what it's able to do is our size, but also like we have different climates. So we're able to grow things at different seasons we shouldn't have been able to. We have different industry. So I think to break it up, you're going to see Canada gobble up part of it. You're going to see Mexico probably gobble up part of it. So maybe Mexico's a great place to be right now. I don't know. You're going to see Russia probably retake Alaska and things like that. There's a lot of resources there. So I think the problem is for people to think that you can just kind of let the currency collapse, create something new, and have these little power blocks. You're going to be sadly mistaken that it's not going to last very long because your neighbors are going to say, "I live here now." Like that's what you're going to run into. Your neighbors meaning other countries.
And what you said earlier, where you had an emperor only in name, I kind of feel like we're going to start having a government only in name because things will start to break down. I mean, even in Mexico here, it's in many ways we have a government only in name in Mexico. I think from here on out, we're going to be moving from, we talked about Rome and then the bigger empires that came British and then the American Empire. I mean, it's got nearly 1,000 bases around the world. That's never happened before, I think, in the history of the world. And I think from here on out, my opinion is that we're going to be transitioning to probably I think the end of history at some point, the world government, world empire, the final world empire, what Huxley talked about, the final revolution. And eventually that too will, I think, collapse at some point. The Tower of Babel idea, Nimrod, God just laughs and snaps his fingers and it all comes tumbling down. And so this was a great, I think, overview, Jeremy. And any final thought for us then?
Well, I think the thing that I am, I don't want people to think I'm just a doomer. I am ultimately hopeful because the thing I'm hopeful about is we have more open communication than Rome ever had because you and I are having conversations like this. People wouldn't have known in the Roman Empire. They just would have, their new reality would be here and that would be it. Like, you know what I mean? Like COVID 1984 would have come in and that would be your new government. I think the thing that's happening is we have the ability to push back a bit now. So I am hopeful that, not that I want America to continue to be an empire, but I am hopeful that I think we don't have to collapse. We can kind of come out of this in better shape than it looks like we're gonna.
Yeah, and this talk about hopeful or optimistic lately, I'm just kind of thinking that's also become irrelevant. Like things are as they are, and you just live your life. I had this discussion a while back with my mother, and I've given up on really caring about my other country of Croatia. We had a republic for 20 years, and now we're in this communist globalist technocracy of Euroslavia, the Fourth Reich, European Union. And then I just kind of given up on caring and just like get used to make the best you can living in this Fourth Reich system, because looking at the example of my peoples, we're living under the European Union, then the Republic of Croatia, then Yugoslavia, then the Nazi fascist state of Croatia for 3 years during World War II, then the Kingdom of the Serbs and Slovenes, then the Austro-Hungarian Empire, then the Roman Empire. And it's just like, this is a fact of life. And even if things do decline in America, I think as an individual, if you mitigate things and do the best you can still have a very enjoyable life. Look at Americans that lived during the Depression, Great Depression. A lot of people suffered, but the others who were, go-getters, they did all right. And so, all right,
just remember, Diocletian was trying to make Rome great again. So, I take that for what it is.
there you go. Make Rome great. It doesn't sound as good as MAGA, but anyways, tell us. All your links are, as always, in the description. But tell us about your projects and all that.
Yeah, so I run a company called Command Your Brand, and we facilitate conversations just like this because I think it's important that we have an ability to communicate openly. So if you want to find out more about what we're doing, we're over at commandyourbrand.com, or if you want to follow me on X or any other platform, I know at the moment we're still on YouTube. I am at Jeremy Ryan Slate on all platforms. Also, we recently launched a brand new YouTube channel, which is growing like gangbusters because we just talk about the Roman Empire, which apparently YouTube is okay with. So that's called Jeremy Roman Empire if you want to go subscribe to that one.
As always, great chatting with you, Jeremy. Thanks for being on Geopolitics and Empire.
Thanks for having me, man.